Farming Outlook with Farmers Weekly. Transition live on Thursday the 8th of May at the University of Leeds Farm, bringing together farmers, policymakers and key industry experts for a day of exchanging knowledge, collaboration and networking.
Come and ask questions. Come and find out about the topics that you're passionate about. Come and talk to your experts in business or livestock production, soil, carbon, environment, whatever it might be.
Tickets are available now. Simply search online Farmers Weekly Transition Live.
Welcome to this special episode of the Farmers Weekly podcast, a Farmers Weekly Question Time event recorded here at the Tenant Farmers Association conference, kindly hosted at Windsor Great Park by the Crown Estate and supported by Burgess Salmon. This Question Time session focuses largely on environmental farm business tenancies. New style 15-year tenancies giving tenant farmers and the Crown Estate the opportunity to benefit from diversification and environmental income and share the benefits. We hope you enjoy the listen. Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome to a special Farmers Weekly Question Time session here at the Tenant Farmers Association conference. I'm your host, Johan Tasker. We've had some great speakers this morning, and now is your chance to ask them some questions, test their arguments, and hold at least one of them to account. We're going to do this in a civilised manner, of course, persistent and probing perhaps, but our panel who will be answering your questions: Daniel Zeichner MP is Defra Minister of State for Food Security and Rural Affairs. Paul Sedgwick, Deputy Ranger and Managing Director of Windsor and Rural for the Crown Estate. Kevin Kennedy, Partner at law firm Burgess Salmon. And Kevin has led Burgess Salmon's input into environmental farm business tenancies. And last but by no means least, George Dunn, as you all know, Chief Executive of the Tenant Farmers Association. First of all, though, what I'd like to do in Farmers Weekly Question Time tradition, please put your hands together and give our panel a big welcome. Our first question, please, from David Meredith. And David, if you could say who you are and where you're from, and then ask your question, please.
David Meredith. I'm the Shropshire lead for the TFA, farm in Shropshire, and also run the consultancy business, DJM Consulting. My question to the panel relates to missed opportunities. It is my view that the Agricultural Act 2020, although it had food security in the legislation, an obligation to report, it did not have any teeth, and so that was a missed opportunity. I just wonder whether there is a missed opportunity that food is not in the title of the new eFBT. Should it be an FBT for food and the environment? Thank
you, David. I'm actually going to ask the Minister to begin with. I mean, this idea that food production, food security, it is important to Defra, even though, as David says, not mentioned too often or as often as he would like in the Agriculture Act.
Well, first of all, thank you for the question. I think it's a really important one. I'll try and keep my comments brief because this is a subject very close to my heart and I could talk for a very long time on it. The Agriculture Act at that period of time, of course, went through a number of iterations. The previous version in the previous Parliament had barely mentioned food production, which I think people found fairly extraordinary. There was then, quite rightly, quite a strong response to that. So the 2020 Act, the finished version, does recognise food production. But I think you're absolutely right to point out, I think there's been a change in the debate. 5 years ago, 10 years ago maybe, all the emphasis was on making sure we tackled the environmental challenges. Hence the name of the schemes, if you like, environmental land management. But at that point, many, and I would say I would include myself, I was at that time the opposition spokesperson, was making the point that food production had to be a primary purpose for farming. And that is a position that my my party and my Secretary of State has continued to make strongly. But you're right, in terms of the legislative framework, it is not as clear perhaps as we would like it to be. But that food security report, the previous government wanted it to be done once every 5 years. We at the time argued for it to be done much more frequently. A compromise was arrived at with the House of Lords for it to be 3 years, so we've had 2 of them now. But I think food security is rising and rising up the agenda. So virtually every speech I do, I mention it as a key part of our national security. On your point about what we've been hearing about this morning, I'll leave it to others to comment. But I would say that providing we understand the primary purpose of farming is food production, then this actually fits alongside that, but it's got to be that understanding.
Thank you, Minister. George, should food be in the title of the Environmental Farm Business Tenancies?
I mean, a farm has many facets to it. It's a home, so should it be the home and Environmental Farm Business Tenancy? You know, the name, to my mind, needs to be simple and catchy. And if you look at the 1995 Act and the 1986 Act, which was before it, you'd find it difficult to find the word food even written in the legislation. So I think it's synonymous with the fact that people consider farming is about food. What we wanted to do with this agreement was to say, actually, tenant farmers shouldn't just be restricted to growing food. Food is a really important aspect of what we are doing on these farms. But we want to broaden the horizons of tenant farmers to be able to engage in both environmental and diversified activities. So I'm not embarrassed at all about the fact that food's not in the title.
Paul, can I ask the same question to you, David? David's suggestion that food...
It's got me thinking, actually. Did we miss something? I think one of our North Stars in our strategy, which the team were quite insistent on, was that food production was at the centre of everything that we were seeking to look after, enhance and protect moving forward. I think the widening of the user clause, when you see, have you seen the agreement? When you see it, we've widened the user clause and tried to move into a space where I think there has to be a realisation that it is becoming increasingly difficult to generate a sensible return from primary crop production. And we wanted to broaden out the agreement as far as we could to scoop up all these other existing and unknown income streams that may come in the future. If you think back to the 95 Act, nobody in 95 was talking about rooftop solar or microgrids or everything, biodiversity net gain. You know, nobody was talking about that. It didn't really exist. So this is version 15. We may end up on version 25 quite soon. Sorry, Kevin. But you know, I think we're open to this debate. We're open to this challenge. But I think we would, at the heart of this is making sure that our family farms can exist in the future. We are an owner of let land. We don't have a desire, other than at Windsor, to farm ourselves. And I think our objectives of land ownership are different to other institutional owners and organisations. And I think the very makeup of our portfolio, 60% of it is grade 1 and 2. It's the very best land you can get for food production. So I think, I would love you to sit down and read the suite of documents and see if it answers your question. If it doesn't, then, let us know via George. Because, nothing is fixed in stone. This is, in the absence of anyone in the profession having a go at something different, this was our attempt to kick the ball up in the air. We did not know what was going to come down. And I'm fascinated by the feedback we're going to get today, because we spent a lot of time talking to ourselves and about these things and talking to our farmers. But actually a wider farming industry and professional industry body peer review is really good stuff to do.
Have you still got the microphone, David? I was just going to, it's coming back to you, but I was just going to ask her what you think, and I appreciate that it's early days, that you've not seen the agreement, but your thoughts?
I probably should have said earlier, I really do welcome what's been done, and I think it's a fantastic achievement. But I think it's very easy for us to become trendy, and the environment is really important, don't get me wrong, but it is the trendy bit, and the primary focus for farming is food production. And if we forget that, we forget it at our peril, as recent events have highlighted.
Kevin Kennedy.
Really interesting point. It's a really good question from David. And it is a concern that people just see, oh, it's all about the environment. It's not about the working farm business. Just to allay David's concerns, once we had this model, we workshopped it with 3 different Crown estates. So 10, 15 tenants from each estate. And that was from an estate that was very, very nature-based to a rural fringe estate. And most interestingly, to a farm, a real food production estate on the East Coast. And it was getting the input from those farmers who are interested in food production and want to do some of the ecological stuff within the context of food production really was quite good, and trying to reassure them was a good point, I thought.
Thanks, Kevin. So George has already said that, I think he said earlier that drafting this kind of document would send the shivers down the spine of legal experts. And Paul has said that this is sort of version 15. How difficult was it to come up with this environmental equity?
Well, I was, to the extent it helps, I was sniggering internally when George put up clauses 4 and 5, which were about diversification and potential ecological projects, because we did a lot of internal work on this as well. And one of the last things we did was put it before a group of colleagues who had not seen it at all. And one of my colleagues in particular was looking at this going, you can't do this. This isn't how we do it. We don't do that at all. Because it was talking about what the Crown and what the farmer aspire to, rather than you must do this, you must do that. And so bringing that mindset into the words whilst trying to keep it as low-key as possible and as light as possible was an interesting challenge, and it involved a lot of red pen, a lot of stuff coming out.
Thank you very much. Before we go on to the next question, is there anybody in the audience who'd like to make a point at all? And if you do, just stick up your hand and wait for the microphone. Just say who you are and where you're from, and then ask your question.
I just want to make a comment really that, I put my hand as the dissenting one that said it shouldn't necessarily be core food production. And that's really to avoid a polarisation that says, oh, I don't do environment, I produce food. And I don't think you can actually isolate or divide between those two things. And I think this eFBT enables us to do that.
Thank you. And the gentleman over there, just say who you are, where you're from, and then I'll go to the lady in the third row.
James Gray, I'm a tenant farmer from Hampshire. I'd just like to make the point that the only way you grow a country's economy is by exporting. And if we stop producing one more vital industry, we'll have nothing left to export. You can't export green agendas.
Thank you very much. And the lady on the third row, just wait for the microphone. Just here. Thank you.
Hello, Ellie Ord. I'm a recommended professional, not actually a land agent. Just a brief comment. I think the emphasis on the food is because if the farmers aren't producing the food, or the British farmers aren't producing the food, who is going to do it? Everybody's interested in the environment. You can get every specialist, every firm, everybody's got an environmental policy, but who else is doing the food? We'll be importing, as the gentleman just said. So that's my concern about food being an emphasis. Who else is going to do it?
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm going to move on to our next question. Mark Peters, please. Say who you are, where you're from, Mark. Thank you.
Mark Peters, mixed farmer from East Sussex. So for farmers that aren't going to be lucky enough to get an eFBT, which will probably be quite a few across the country, if we're moving into an era of low subsidy or even no subsidy for agriculture, what do you see the future for tenant farming, and how should tenant farmers be reacting to that new era?
George, I'm going to go straight to you on that. What would your advice be to farmers? I mean, this eFBT is not going to be for everybody. Not everybody's going to be able to access it. What would your advice be to tenant farmers who...
Yeah, so I absolutely believe that the system of tenant farming is still a really good way to do agriculture, combining, as I said in my speech, those individuals who are asset rich but lack the entrepreneurial flair, but those who have the entrepreneurial flair and willing to take risk, allowing that liquidity, allowing new entrants in, and it's still always going to be a good way to do farming. I have been, as I said, in the TFA for 30 years, and I've seen the ebbs and flows of agriculture. When I came in 1996, when we had a really, really top year, part of that was due to currency fluctuations with the way in which we fell out of the ERM at the time. Then obviously things fell off the cliff in 1997. And then we had foot and mouth in 2001, and all sorts of things happening. But the system of agriculture, tenant farming, has remained resilient. But what we've been unable to do until relatively recently is to use the flexibility that's available to us to reach long-term sustainable solutions. And if there is if there's anything which we should be taking away from today, it's the opportunity for landlords and tenants to be able to put an architecture together which creates a long-term sustainable view for both the landlord and the tenant, where rent is not just the only discussion that takes place between the parties, but we are able to exploit the food markets, the environmental markets, and the diversification markets to ensure we have sustainable business going forward. Now, this agreement is not going to fix the supply chain, Mark. This agreement is not going to change the relationship between farmers and processors and retailers. Work needs to go on to achieve that, and we are obviously talking to government about how to do that. But within the context of where we are for such a time as this agreement, in my view, gives the best chance for parties to do that. And I would hope that other landlords and tenants around the country would emulate what the Crown Estate is doing here.
Thanks, George. You have already had interest from other large landowners?
Yeah, so we've already had discussions with the likes of the National Trust, obviously a big landowner, as you've seen from Paul's slide, the Church Commissioners, the Duchy of Lancaster, Duchy of Cornwall, private estates as well are very interested to get their hands on this agreement. So I think we could see a major turn of the tide in the way in which relationships develop going forward.
Thank you. Defra Minister Daniel Zeichner.
Yeah, let me echo a lot of the points that George has just made. I think this is a really exciting innovation. And when you outlined it earlier, I thought, wow, was my response. And also what struck me was how much it overlapped with many of the things that Defra's trying to do. So whether it's done through legislation, which is always the way politicians think, or whether it's done through collaboration, which is actually probably a quicker way of doing these things, the end result, which you're trying to achieve, I think is really exciting. I think absolutely is going to be a future for the tenanted sector, because again, for the reasons that George outlined in the beginning of his presentation, it's absolutely the way to get new people in and to progress. And that is something which I feel particularly strongly about. I think one of my observations of the sector is it is hard to get generational change. So this is a key part of that. So I think a bright future for the tenanted sector, but it's going to need initiatives like this to make it work in the new world that we're operating in.
And for farmers that aren't able to get into an agreement like this, that would like to, I mean, many tenant farmers remain restricted in the activities that they can undertake, and some are confined to producing food, and yet would welcome the opportunity to do other stuff, be it diversify or environmental incomes.
Well, of course, that is why George spent his whole life pushing me hard to try and get improvements and changes. And that's why we've got the code of practice. That's why we are trying. And in the end, when I speak to land agents, they tell me, oh, anything is possible in terms of these agreements. George chuckles because I think perhaps his experience is that anything is possible within a fairly narrow band sometimes. But that doesn't stop people being more imaginative. And I hope that by setting a really good example like this, others will follow.
Thank you. Kevin Kennedy, is there stuff that farmers can do when they're not in this kind of agreement? How can they maximise the opportunities from a legal point of view?
I think Paul and George have kind of set the tone, which is this is looking to lead, and this should disseminate down through the industry, because one of the issues has been, how do you achieve this without doing quite an old-fashioned stick-first approach? Whereas this is a far more of a partnership approach, because the stick doesn't really work. The National Trust did some research about 15 years ago, which was showing that it was actually providing some element of carrot if you were looking to change how your farmers or develop how your farmers dealt with their land. So this should be feeding through the industry, and I would hope it's feeding through it fairly rapidly.
Thank you. Mark, you asked the question, that would suggest that this is an option that's not going to be open to yourself? Or?
No, we're very lucky. Our landlords work with us and we've done similar things already, but there's many, many farmers, certainly in our area in the southeast, that don't have anywhere near those options. And the Minister they're very proactive at the moment at saying that farming is a business. I couldn't agree more that farming needs to be a business going forward, but the actual profitability of farming, especially on the arable sector at the moment, I mean, the years of 2006, 2012 and 2022 were massively profitable. But that's 3 years in quarter of a century. So without that BPS money, and now not being able to use the SFI money to prop that up, it's a quite high-risk time for arable farmers, I would say.
Thank you very much. A good opportunity to ask the Minister. I mean, you said that there will be, it's not that the SFI has gone away. Can you give any guarantees that when it comes back it will be in a similar form, or is it going to be SFI only in name and at a much reduced rate open to far fewer farmers?
Well, at the moment, the overall budget, and I mean, it's a complex set of schemes. SFI actually is not a huge component of the overall spending, important though it is. At the moment, the overall budget for the next 2 years is 5 billion, which is higher than some people expected before the previous spending review. Now, I can't predict over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years what future governments will choose to do. But it goes back to the previous question in a way, the sense that somehow there will not be any money coming from government to do these things. I think that's highly unlikely, because if you look at the environmental targets that are set down in law, it's hard to see how they're going to be achieved without significant intervention from government, which should provide a regular income stream for farmers. It's different from before, in a sense it's not the area-based payment system, and this, I think, is a hard thing that we're going through this change. We're going from that to paying for environmental goods under the terms of the Agriculture Act. But the amount of money that will overall be available will be a choice for each government in turn when it comes to spending reviews, which is why it's very important that we can demonstrate the success that we're having. And this does worry me a bit at the moment, because one of the things that I was critical of during the passage of the Act and in opposition was it wasn't very clear how we measured what we were getting with the public money. And if I'm going to the Chancellor and saying I want more, which I do, she's going to say to me, well, what are you getting? And if I say, well, I don't really know, I can tell you how that conversation ends. So it's a real onus on all of us. Now, so actually, there is some good data coming through. And I think as we get that and we can build a clear picture of what it is we are doing as a sector to really protect and transform the environment and nature, then we've got a very powerful case for support in future.
Thank you very much. So it's all about monitoring and measuring the results.
I think in the modern world it absolutely is about it being evidence-based. And so it's almost like a challenge to all of us, because this opens up a whole new set of questions, and none of this is easy, but that is what people want to know. What are we getting for our money?
Thank you. Bangs for our buck. Can I just ask, Paul, the new eFBT, is it going to be open to all of your tenants? Is this the way the new thing is going to be done, or is it going to be an optional agreement that they can do one or the other?
No, I think that the aim is that we will transition all expiring current FBTs onto the new form of document. A lot of those FBTs were only for 2, 3, 4 years. because of the impact on capital values by granting a longer lease. So I think the newer lease, the longer term, enables us to have better conversations with our farmers about what they want out of their business. A lot, are beginning to think about succession, next generation coming through. We desperately need that next generation to come through. The average age of our farmers must begin with a 6. They're all predominantly in their 60s. So I think we listening to the conversation. This is the first attempt within the industry. I think one point I wanted to raise is I think the industry I work in, the rural surveying industry, needs to change. It is so old-fashioned and stuck in its ways. That was intended to get a reaction from surveyors within the room. For those that work with me know that the odd hand grenade gets thrown.
Before we move on, could you just give, for example, one example, one big frustration?
Well, we are trying to do something that is novel, it's different, there's change. 99% of our farmers want to come on the journey with us. And then you get the agent arguing about where the comma is on a document, and you're thinking you're missing the bigger picture here. And there are some frustrations around that. I think, we want it to be a collaborative journey. The brains trust in this room alone could probably move version 15 on to be a better version straight away. But we've had interest. We've shared it with the duchies. We shared it with the National Trust. We shared it with Defra, and it will be available to anybody that wants a copy after this meeting. We want feedback. This real-time feedback at the moment is fantastic. We want to make it better. It won't be the panacea for all, and we are having to have different forms of conversation with our farmers who have got double cropping veg land in Lincolnshire. It's a different conversation, particularly around the green agenda. What's interesting, though, when just pause on that point, is that some of the biggest uptake in environmental measures through our Rural Environment Fund has come from these Grade 1 estates, where they're seeing the importance of putting back hedgerows to stop soil erosion and wind blow, etc. So it's playing out in ways that we never envisaged it would. Doesn't mean we've got it right or wrong. Time will be the test on that. But we are looking very seriously at how we collect this data, because I agree with the Minister that the collection, monitoring and presentation of data is going to be so important to fighting the farmer's corner going forward around accessing funding, etc. So we're looking as organisationally how we try and put in place some form of data monitoring and collection across all our farms. And again, we may have to help with that because it's a costly exercise, but it will give us the data that we are required as a company to report on through the financial disclosures and nature disclosures, but it also gives the farmer real-time data around the changes that they're making to their farming system around carbon emissions, biodiversity enhancement, and crop yields as well. So,
thank you. Thanks, Paul. I'm going to ask Kevin in a minute, and sort of drafting this on version 15, what was his biggest sort of frustration, or the biggest challenge of being able to get something sort of watertight legally. But before I do, I'm going to be a bit cheeky and ask George, is there something that you wish that was in there that isn't in there, or that you're still trying to work through and hope that eventually will be included?
It's all. I thought when we started this journey, when we saw version 2, and I sent Kevin my raft of changes, which went on for about 5 pages of email, I think, I was concerned that this was a mountain too high to climb, and that the Crown and the Burgess Salmon would say, nah, we're not going there, don't worry. I was immensely surprised and amazed at how little pushback there was from staff. And whilst they might have said, well, I see where you're coming from, George, I wouldn't have put it that way. How about something along these lines? And we would mull it over and think about it and change a few words, and we'd end up with a position that was agreed between the parties. So actually, I can sit here and say there was no significant pushback from the Crown or from Burgess Salmon on the stuff that we wanted to see in the agreement. And of course, there needs to be a certain degree of scaffolding around which a legal agreement has to be structured. So there's some necessary stuff in there that you can't get away from. But in terms of the shape of that scaffolding and what that scaffolding was there to do, hand on heart, these guys were very open-handed in the way in which they approached the challenge that we put to them. So my 5 pages of email were very quickly turned into innovative clauses in the agreement, and thanks to both.
I mean, going from FBTs, an average sort of length of 3 to 4 years, to something that's 15 years, no opportunity, as I understand it, for the landlord to get out of that, but there is an opportunity for the tenant in certain circumstances. I mean, that's quite an achievement, yeah? Yeah, so the average, as I said in my speech, the average length of term is just between 3 and 4 years, and 85% of the tenancies are for 5 years or less. I mean, the one way in which we've got around the issue of capital values that Paul mentioned, and I understand that if the Treasury is requiring the Crown Estate to report on capital values, the last thing the Crown Estate wants to do is to show a huge reduction in the capital value of its estate for a lot of reasons. And we've built in clauses which provide the landlord with the opportunity to, if there's a need to sell the land, and there's a mechanism within that to do that the land can be taken back. But what we've avoided are those no-fault, cliff edge, break clauses in agreements which says this is a 15-year agreement, but it can be ended in 5 and 10 years by either party. Those are taken out completely. But the tenant does have the ability periodically, if they find actually this isn't working, to say, actually, we want to get out. So for the Crown to relinquish its right to a break clause in this agreement, other than for when it needs to sell or for development, which understandably a landlord will want to have that, is a really, really, really big step forward. Thank you. And Paul, you're not, as the Crown, you're used to taking a long-term view, I guess. Not recently, only until recently.
But I think we learned quite early on it's just better to agree with George. No, I think there were some challenges at the time around the reasons we had to sell land, because as an organisation, if you floated the Crown on the FTSE, we'd be in the top 50 companies in the country in terms of scale and size, but we had no ability to borrow money. So we would have to self-finance, in essence. So, and when you're doing very, very big projects in the centre of London, they are very expensive. So accessing a source of low yielding in terms of revenue generation capital was done through the sale of rural land. That strategy changed with the change of our chief exec and also some, I think, very sensible and pragmatic conversations with Treasury as well. We now have a position that the recent Crown Estate Act went through Parliament, received royal assent, that has given us borrowing and investment powers, which means that we don't have to have these sort of really difficult conversations. That doesn't mean that we won't trade in and trade out of land as any landowner does, but we are acquisitive at the moment, and it is very much our aim to grow the portfolio and to grow a portfolio of let land. It's not land that we want in hand. It's let land. We're very heavy on grade 1 and 2 in England. We're very heavy on upland commons in Wales, and we don't have much in between. So, our shopping list is probably around grade 3 at the moment, grade 3, grade 4 land, which gives us long-term optionality over different land uses that we can put onto it. Thank you. And Kevin Kennedy, drafting all these 15 or so
versions? Was there anything did you throw your hands up in despair, or were you just counting the money and thinking, bring it on?
That's a very cynical approach, yeah. Expect that from the press. Actually, the biggest thing was getting our heads around and selling, i.e. getting other people's heads around, this idea of the Green Book and the Partnership Book as sitting outside a tenancy agreement, completely different, not a schedule of covenants somewhere, but something which is aspirational, as something that's worked on together, and also engaging with the very good managing agents the Crown has, because one of the features of this is that rather than this farm goes to market, let's see who tenders the best rent, the letting process is a more elaborate thing, and it has to be a more elaborate thing because you're talking about a long-term relationship where the farm at the end of that 15-year period is probably quite different from the farm that went into it.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Question from the floor just over there. Just say, wait for the microphone, say who you are, where you're from, and ask the question.
Chris Findlay Forsters. I'm a recommended solicitor on the TFA panel. I just wanted to pick up on the point that was made by Paul about old-fashioned professionals, and I think it was made in the context of surveyors being locked into a certain way of approaching problems. And to say in response and defence, I suppose, that all professionals that I know of in this industry don't actually have a view themselves. They reflect exactly the view that their client wants. And it is landlords who are particularly entrenched who will say to the surveyor, no, I don't want this and I don't want that, I want this, this and this, and I want this very traditional, and I don't want to have the tenant being able to convert buildings or anything like that because it might infect my inheritance tax position and so on. So when you look at collaboration, the sell that you've got to do on the eFBT, in my view, has to be aimed at landlords and has to be rooted through organisations like the Country Landowners Association very hard, because there are the die-hard landlords that exist all over the country. Some of them have converted, but a lot of them haven't. And when we first kicked around the idea of the 1995 legislation, the very first idea we came up with was a 14-year fixed-term lease, following roughly along the lines of a business lease as applied to an office or a factory or whatever. And it's interesting that it's taken 30 years to come back to now to having a 15-year as a minimum term. And I feel if the collaboration can be pushed through to landlords, then tenants will take it up. There's no doubt. I don't know a tenant who would say, oh no, I don't want a 15-year lease, I only want a 3-year one. And ultimately, if collaboration doesn't work, I'm afraid that the landlords have eaten a very large number of carrots, mainly with environmental payments written on them, and they probably need to be offered a little bit more stick from the Treasury. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to come? Well, to give Paul the opportunity to come back. Chris is saying that surveyors only looking after their clients' best interests.
Christopher, thank you for punching back, taking it on the chin. Look, I think, I've worked on both sides of the fence. I've worked early career with a very good firm of national agents, then for private estates, and now a sort of a more institutional landlord. Most landlords listen to the advice they're given by their agents and lawyers, would be my reply, and accountants. So I think it is actually beholden on us as a profession to start changing that mindset. But I think I'd use the analogy that we've seen with our farmers. We had early adopters, both on FBTs and AHAs, where we had no contractual input, really. And we've got farmers who have aligned their AHA work to some of the aspirations that have come out of the Green Book and the Pink Book. We didn't ask them to do it, they felt it was the right thing to do. We just created the space, the guardrail, the funding to do that. But I think in our portfolio, we had the early adopters. We had those farmers looking over the hedge to see what the neighbour was doing, and then quite a few of those have jumped on board. And then we have those that I speak in Russian to. And at the moment, we are leaving them be. There will come a time when we probably have to have a more crunchy conversation than some of the earlier ones. But I think at least we will be able to say to them, go and see your neighbour's farm, see what you think. You know, a lot of our farmers on the Crown have been with us an awful long time. And I think our relationship with them has ebbed and flowed a bit because of various reasons, particularly around the sales and the fear of having farms sold. But it's really engendered a conversation now with our farmers and an energy, which I don't think we've seen for a while. And I want to I think all of us want to just put this agreement out there. Not that it's the Holy Grail. It's not. It's just an attempt to answer a question. It's, you know, if all the professionals in the room came back saying, we can make this better, and to your point of farmers not being offered it, there's nothing to say to that tenant farmer, get in touch with your agent or the TFA and ask if it's an option. Because a lot of landlords, a lot of advisors won't know that there is a different way than the old style, agricultural tenancy eFBT. So, thank you, George.
Yeah, just very briefly. I've known Chris for many years, love and respect him. But I think I have had the privilege of speaking to a lot of landlords in my 30 years with the TFA. And very often I get the view from the landlords of saying, look, we're not property experts, we're not tax experts, we're not rural surveying experts. We take the advice of our professionals. And sometimes the professionals, in my view, don't dive in enough to understand what it is the landlord wants to achieve in those issues. And I fall into that trap as well in terms of the work that I do with the TFA. So when we have a member who calls us with a particular problem, you immediately get into the technicalities of the problem. What are the problems? How do we resolve this problem? And I've learned to ask the question, what does success look like for you? What, at the end of the day, what is it you want to achieve? We have this problem, but where do you want to get to? And very often, the problem is a catalyst to a much different answer to the question, which produces something which is beneficial to all parties. So all I would say is, it behoves us all, tenants, landlords, agents, lawyers, or whoever, to find a way to think about the issues that we're talking about today in a more imaginative way.
Thank you. Thanks, George. Before we go on to our next scheduled question, are there any points from the floor or questions from the floor? Gentleman there, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Duncan Sigourney, Thring Solicitors, another recommended professional. Just in terms, I mean, obviously there's a lot of AHA tenants in the room at the moment. When it comes to succession discussions, are you as the Crown Estate offering to include some of the elements from the eFBT into those new succession tenancies, or is that a plan to do that? Or is the only way to access them through essentially cashing in your AHA and taking on an FBT from the Crown?
No, our Rural Environment Fund is available to all our farmers. In fact, quite a lot of the uptake on sort of what we call no regrets moves, planting hedges, restoring ponds, have been on AHA tenancies. There's no pressure on, if there's a succession onto an AHA, why on earth would the farmer want to give that up to put it onto, a 15-year eFBT? I think we've got a lot of farmers who've got single generation AHAs with no succession, but we want to support the incoming son or daughter going forward. And those conversations are at times around granting a longer term tenancy. Same principles apply, the Green Book, the Pink Book, and that sort of wider aspiration. But it's working, I think, quite well. As I said, our uptake on some of the schemes we've just made available ourselves to our farmers it's probably 50-50 between AHA and FBT in terms of uptake. It's been quite encouraging in that sense.
Thank you. Do you want to come back on that at all, or are you?
Yeah, no, thank you. It's a positive answer. I was just trying to work out how an AHA tenant would be able to access some of these sort of flexibilities, if you like, that are within the eFBT. And I appreciate there are complications around succession criteria for another succession in the future. But no, and at the end of the day, I'm presuming both parties want this to be as widely disseminated as possible, and therefore it's great that you're including AHA tenants in that, because they represent such a large portion of the sector. It's a good answer. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to move it on in the absence of anything else to our next. Susie. Just who you are, where you're from, Susie.
Yeah, Susie Horn from Farmers Weekly. Rent. Paul, you acknowledged sometimes that rents may have to come down. I just wondered what the rent review process is under the new eFBT. Will it be a separate process for the land that's subject to environmental measures, and then another negotiation on the, if you like, the productive land, although obviously the environmental measure land may also be very productive? Or is it still all one figure across the board, across all the acres in the agreement?
We've had 2 attempts at this. The first one, I think we were put in the unsuccessful category, lesson learnt, which was trying to work out a blended rent between productive farmland and nature recovery land. I think we quickly moved on to the theory that having 2 separate rents is probably the best way of doing it. So we, on the latest batch of FBTs that are moving on to eFBTs, we have agreed with the farmers a rent for their arable or pasture land, and then a separate rent around land that is transitioning into nature recovery. The aspiration around that rent differential was to, in essence, make an acre of nature recovery more profitable than an acre of wheat. Because it was one of the blockers to our farmers, saying, well, we would love to do it, but you're charging us too high a rent. So, okay, if we take that blocker away, will you do it? Now that was great, but being open with you, that underlying profitability on the nature land was underpinned by the farmer's ability to obtain SFI. So, in the last month, we're having to have a little bit of a rethink about how we deal with this in the interim period before, hopefully, SFI2 comes out the blocks. So, but I think we are genuinely, Susie, worried about that, because there was so much goodwill building within our farmers to do this transition into nature recovery, still producing lots of food, but to do this, because we'd sort of gone on that journey with them around taking a financial hit to help deliver it. So we are having to think about how we deal with that short-term funding issue, and it's something that we may have to use our Rural Environment Fund to help fund to maintain that momentum, because the positivity around it has been really exciting, and we just need to make sure that we don't lose that. So yeah, a good question.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm going to move it. I'm being told 10 minutes at the back, so that chimes with what I've got on my watch as well. So I'm going to move it on to the next question. George Renner, please.
George Renner, a tenant farmer from Rutland. What changes to the definitions of agriculture and good agricultural husbandry does the panel think should be made to help tenant farmers farm?
Thank you, George. So what changes to the definitions of agriculture and good agricultural husbandry does the panel think should be made to help tenant farmers farm? I'm going to ask the Minister to been quiet for a little bit too long. So, Daniel Zeichner.
I think a period of quiet for ministers is often welcome. On this one, I think this is a question I'm going to listen very closely to the experts on. One of the joys of being a minister is you can ask people who know. What I would observe is that when we were doing the Agriculture Act and we were looking at some of the things that were in the Common Agricultural Policy, there were a whole range. I can't actually remember the precise terminology now, but what struck me about it at the time was I wasn't at all convinced that all this was being monitored or how much value it actually added. You could see what was trying to be being done. One thing that's been fascinating for me about this conversation over the last few minutes is how almost identical the conversations you're having about what you're trying to do are to the ones that we're having in Defra about what we're trying to do, with some of the same complexities in terms of the interactions and possible unintended consequences you get depending upon how you set things. This is a really difficult thing we're all trying to do, really important, really valuable, but I do find that fascinating. But on this one, I think I'm going to pass it over to the experts.
Let's go down the panel then. George Dunn, what changes to definitions would you like to see?
So this was an area the Minister will remember we were very active on when we were having the 2020 Agriculture Act going through, and we also had similar discussions in Wales when they had their Agriculture Act going through. Bearing in mind that the definitions that we're talking about here were written in 1947, that was when they were originally penned and put into play. And particularly on the rules of good husbandry, which require individual tenant farmers to maximize the efficient use of their holdings from a production perspective. Now, obviously we've had a discussion about food production already, and that's really important. But what if a tenant farmer wanted to do something from an environmental perspective? How do the rules of good husbandry play for that individual? Now, you might say, well, who's going to take a tenant to task when they're doing stuff for the environment? Very sadly, we have seen situations where the issue in play was not what the tenant was doing, but some other issue over here that the landlord had fallen out with the tenant over 20 years previously. And I can think of an arbitration particularly where the tenant farmer had got what you might call bigger hedges than you would otherwise need from a purely agricultural perspective, because they enjoyed the nature and enjoyed the biodiversity that was being created within them, and the landlord required those hedges to be pared back because it wasn't in keeping with the rules of good husbandry. We objected. We said this is unreasonable. It went to an arbitration on that case, and the arbitrator was forced to award, yes, those hedges do need to be cut back given the nature of that holding. So I think to avoid those potential areas of conflict, having the freedom and the flexibility around the 47 rules of good husbandry, which are talking about make maximum efficient use for the holding from a food production and environmental perspective, I think will be really good. In terms of the definition of agriculture, I've lost count of the number of conversations I have had with members of the TFA who have said, am I allowed to do this within the terms of my tenancy? And the most recent one I've had is a tenant who's looking at selling the carbon that they have sequestrated in the soil through their management of that soil on agreements that are annualized. And I mean, there isn't clarity over whether the stuff that you're doing is agricultural when you're looking at it in the round. And we have smart lawyers saying, well, it's covered by the minerals clause, so the landlord is able to keep that carbon. Well, I don't think it is. So a bit of clarity around that sort of stuff, I think, will be really, really essential for those people who are wanting to game the system, people who want to do the right thing together collegiately, like the Crown is doing. It's not an issue. People will be able to reach agreements. But where people want to game the issue and want to take advantage out of the issue, that's where we got problems. And going back to an earlier question about, what do we do for tenants who haven't got access to this? We still need a good legislative backdrop that creates the rights and responsibilities for all parties to work to.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm going to leave Paul for a minute and do Kevin first. If that's okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
It's a tricky question. We've had this debate a reasonable amount in the context of BNG, because if land is subject to BNG obligations, what is that? Well, I've always thought that is farming. It is a less intense form of farming, but you are still cultivating the land. And in fact, it seems to me pretty much everything, apart from the most extreme version of rewilding, which would just be abandoning the land, is a form of cultivation of the land at a lesser intensity. And I think we just need to make sure that those legislative definitions accommodate that to the extent that it's helpful. These things can happen, and George, I think, is right. It's usually a spin-off of some other breakdown, but they are very rare that you'll be having a row about, or certainly in my experience, a row about good husbandry or something like that. It doesn't tend to happen anymore. It used to a lot, but not so much now.
Thank you, Kevin. Paul?
The easy answer is to say I agree with the panel, but I think I do. I just think there's a modernisation required around quite a lot of these clauses. It gives the essence of why we wanted to do this eFBT, because what was put in place 30 years ago, we just didn't see as being match fit for the next 30 years. And I think farming and agriculture is going through different iterations from where it was in 1947. There's a lot of it which is really good stuff and shouldn't change, but I just think that a modernisation around that would be good, and I think it would provide a bit of clarity for farmers, particularly tenant farmers as well. But I think this, I wanted to interject when George was saying this weaponisation that happens between professionals acting for landlord and farmer is, it's the politics of the playground. It should not happen in 2025. And that's why I made my comments about the profession earlier, because I think, I've seen it, I've probably done it myself in my career, and it's not, I think as you get a bit older and a bit more wiser, you just see there's bigger issues at play than arguing over the size of a hedgerow, for example.
Thank you, Paul. George, are there changes that you would like to see that would make your life easier when it comes to farming?
I'd just like sort of the modern era to be reflected in the legislation, because it just isn't currently. I don't have a specific example of a problem that it's causing me, but it only takes a falling out before something could become a problem, and that's just the worry.
Thank you very much. Right, unless there are any points, I'm going to close this. One quick one though on the back row.
Emily Swift, the Crown Estate. Just a remark to the TFA. I just wonder how you protect the intellectual property from maybe some of the scrupulous landlords with regard to the tenancy. I may envision people taking the eFBT and changing it to what the landlord wants, and using that brand. And I just wonder what the TFA are going to do with the CAAV to protect that.
Okay, I'm only going to ask this to George, and George, you've got about a minute or so. And then
that's fine. I mean, it's a bit like the Bible, isn't it? You can take anything within the Bible and create pretext without reading it within the context. And you've got to accept the whole, which is why Paul is very keen about the eFBT agreement, that it's sent out by Burgess Salmon with all the supporting documentation, so you see it in the round. Of course, there will be nefarious individuals out there who will game the system and try to use it in ways that are inappropriate. We will have to guard against that and call it out when it happens. But if we don't take risk in this environment, nothing will change.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody. In a moment, it is going to be lunch. I am, in a moment, going to hand over to Tenant Farmers Association National Chair Robert Martin. But before I do, could you put your hands together for our panel? Daniel Zeichner MP, Defra Minister of State, Paul Sedgwick for the Crown Estate, Kevin Kennedy, partner at law firm Burgess Salmon, and George Dunn of the Tenant Farmers Association. And that's it for this special episode of the Farmers Weekly podcast. The Farmers Weekly Question Time event recorded at the Tenant Farmers Association annual conference at Windsor Great Park on Thursday, the 1st of May 2020. 2025. Please do subscribe to the Farmers Weekly podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and if you really like what you hear, please do leave us a 5-star review. I'm your host, Johan Tasker. Thank you for listening.